Empires usually die with explosions. This one died with a contract. In the middle of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire did not lose a decisive battle. It signed an agreement. That agreement was a foreign loan. No territory changed hands. No throne collapsed. But control began moving immediately. The document promised money in exchange for interest. What it really transferred was leverage. From that moment, the empire's survival depended on schedules written abroad. Miss a payment, and diplomacy changed. Delay interest, and pressure followed. The signature was meant to fund a war. It ended up financing dependence. The Ottomans believed they were buying time. European bankers knew they were buying influence. No one in that room called it a surrender. But history would. Because this was the moment the empire stopped fighting enemies and started answering creditors. When that contract was signed, the Ottoman Empire did not see itself as collapsing. It still governed vast territory. It still collected taxes across 3 continents. Its army still existed on paper and on parade grounds. This mattered because the decision to borrow was not driven by panic. It was driven by confidence. States that believe they are weak hesitate. States that believe they are strong take risks. The Ottoman leadership assumed this was manageable. Wars had always strained the treasury. Temporary shortages were normal. Borrowing was framed as administration, not dependency. A tool, not a turning point. The empire still believed it controlled its own future. That belief made the agreement possible, because no one signs away sovereignty intentionally. They sign believing they can reverse it later. The Ottomans expected victory to stabilize finances. They expected taxes to recover. They expected repayment to be routine. Europe's money did not arrive as a threat. It arrived as confirmation that the empire still mattered. That assumption shaped everything that followed. The problem was not that the empire lacked power, it was that it overestimated how long power could protect it from arithmetic. The loan solved the war problem. It created a money problem. The Ottoman state was built to collect taxes and spend them, not to service long-term foreign debt. Interest payments hit first. They were fixed. Taxes were not. Every year, a portion of state revenue left the empire automatically, before soldiers were paid, before roads were built, before reforms could be funded. This was new. In earlier centuries, war drained the treasury, but victory refilled it. Now, war consumed cash without replacing it. Modern armies were expensive. Modern weapons had to be imported. Logistics mattered more than numbers. The state adapted in the worst possible way. Instead of cutting spending, it borrowed again. Instead of reforming taxation, it delayed. Instead of shrinking the machine, it fed it. New loans didn't fund growth. They funded survival. Debt began paying debt. By the 1860s, the budget was distorted. A growing share of income never touched Ottoman soil. It moved directly from taxpayers to European bondholders. Control hadn't been lost yet, but choice had. Every decision now required cash it didn't fully own. Every crisis pushed the state back to the same lenders. The empire still looked powerful, but financially it was cornered. And once borrowing becomes routine, default stops being a question of if. It becomes a question of when. The shift did not happen in abstraction. It happened through people. Inside the imperial system, decisions were being made by men who were educated, pressured, and deeply aware that the world around them was changing faster than the empire itself. These were not reckless figures or naive traditionalists. They read European reports, studied modern administration, and understood that military survival now depended on money as much as manpower. This particular decision-maker was operating under constraint. War had exposed weaknesses. Allies were watching closely. Rivals were waiting for signs of failure. Every option on the table carried risk, but inaction carried more. Reform took time. Tax systems could not be rebuilt overnight. Armies could not pause while revenue structures caught up. European finance offered an answer that felt modern, technical, and contained. Loans were presented as tools used by advanced states, not traps designed for collapse. The language was professional. The numbers were precise. The timelines looked reasonable. This was not framed as dependence. It was framed as efficiency. The logic was straightforward. Borrow now. Stabilize the situation. Repay once pressure eases. Control remains internal. Sovereignty remains untouched. From inside the system, the choice did not look dangerous. It looked responsible. And that is how structural dependence usually begins. Not with villains or betrayal, but with officials trying to manage problems faster than institutions can adapt, trusting mechanisms they do not fully control while believing they still have time. The pressure reached its peak during the Crimean War. The Ottoman Empire was fighting Russia in a conflict it could not afford to lose and could not finance alone. Britain and France stood as allies, but their support came with conditions that extended beyond soldiers and ships. Money became the decisive factor. The cost of war escalated rapidly. Armies had to be paid on schedule. Weapons had to be purchased from abroad. Supplies had to move across long distances. The treasury could not keep up. Traditional methods of raising cash were exhausted, and delay was not an option. Defeat would have been immediate and catastrophic. In this context, the loan was presented as a solution, not a gamble. In 1854, the Ottoman government signed its first foreign loan agreement with European bankers. On the surface, it appeared simple. The state would receive cash, continue the war, and repay the debt once stability returned. The document carried interest, fees, and obligations, but none of them felt decisive at the time. What mattered was speed. The money arrived quickly. Soldiers were paid, supplies resumed, the immediate crisis disappeared. For the men in charge, the decision felt vindicated. The empire had survived the moment of danger. What was less visible was the structure of the agreement itself. The state did not receive the full value of what it promised to repay. Commissions and discounts were built in from the start. Interest was calculated on sums larger than the cash delivered. The burden began before the relief fully settled. The loan ended the crisis of war finance. It created a permanent obligation that did not end with peace. From that point forward, repayment schedules became part of imperial decision-making, binding future choices to commitments made under pressure. The first loan did not feel dangerous because it worked. That success changed behavior. Once borrowing proved it could solve an immediate crisis, it became the default response to every new problem that followed. Peace did not bring relief. It brought bills. Interest payments continued even when cannons stopped firing. Revenue that once funded administration now had to be reserved in advance for creditors. The budget narrowed, not because the empire collapsed, but because commitments hardened. When cash ran short again, the solution was familiar. Another loan, then another, each one justified as temporary, each one framed as necessary to protect stability. The logic repeated itself with small variations, but the direction never changed. New loans were increasingly used to service old ones. Interest payments consumed a growing share of income, leaving less room to absorb shocks. To cover the gap, borrowing accelerated. The empire was no longer using debt to finance emergencies. It was using debt to maintain normal operations. European bankers noticed, terms tightened, interest rates rose, fees increased. Control over repayment schedules shifted outward. The more the empire borrowed, the less leverage it had in negotiation. Dependency reversed the balance of power. Currency pressure followed. Confidence weakened. Any disruption, poor harvests, regional unrest, administrative delays, now carried financial consequences that reached beyond borders. Domestic problems triggered foreign reactions. Internal policy began producing external consequences. The structure was simple. Revenue came in slowly, debt obligations left immediately. Timing mattered more than totals. Even when enough money existed on paper, liquidity vanished before it could be used. By the late 1860s and early 1870s, borrowing was no longer a strategy. It was a habit. Each loan postponed reckoning while making the eventual adjustment more painful. The system could still function, but it could no longer stop. This was not collapse, it was entrapment. Like using one credit card to pay another, the empire stayed afloat by moving obligations forward, losing flexibility with every cycle, while convincing itself that the next round would restore balance. By the mid-1870s, the arithmetic could no longer be managed. Debt payments consumed a dominant share of state revenue, leaving the government unable to meet both its internal obligations and its external promises at the same time. The empire faced a choice that every indebted state eventually confronts: pay creditors or function as a government. New borrowing was no longer possible. European markets had lost confidence, and lenders who once competed to extend credit now refused to offer it at any price. The mechanism that had sustained the system abruptly stopped working. There was no final emergency to borrow against, no new instrument to delay reality. In 1875, the Ottoman government formally announced that it could not meet its debt obligations in full. Payments were reduced and restructured unilaterally. In diplomatic language, this was a moratorium. In financial terms, it was a default. The reaction was immediate and severe. European investors who had purchased Ottoman bonds saw their income cut overnight. Political support evaporated alongside financial trust. The empire's credibility collapsed across markets and capitals simultaneously. Inside the state, the consequences were humiliating. Officials understood that default did more than damage reputation. It removed protection. Credit had been the shield that preserved alliances. Without it, the empire stood exposed. The default did not end the state, but it ended autonomy over finance. From that moment forward, negotiations were no longer conducted as between equals. They were conducted under supervision. The empire still existed. Its institutions remained. Its rulers still governed. But the ability to decide how money would be raised, allocated, and spent had effectively been forfeited, replaced by oversight designed to ensure one thing above all else: repayment. Default did not end the debt. It reorganized power around it. European creditors were no longer willing to rely on promises from a government they did not trust. So they demanded something more concrete than words. They demanded direct access to revenue. In 1881, that access was formalized. A new institution was created to manage Ottoman debt repayment, but it did not answer to the Sultan or the state. It answered to foreign bondholders. Through this mechanism, some of the empire's most reliable sources of income were removed from government control and reassigned to external administration. Taxes on salt, tobacco, customs duties, and other predictable revenues were no longer collected for the Ottoman treasury. They were collected to service debt. The process was systematic, legal, and enforced. Money moved from subjects to creditors without passing through imperial decision-making. The state still governed territory. Laws were still issued. Officials still held office. But financial authority had shifted. The empire could no longer decide freely how much it could spend, where it could invest, or which priorities mattered most. Revenue arrived, already spoken for. This was not occupation. There were no foreign troops marching through the capital. There was no formal annexation. Control was exercised through accounting, schedules, and enforcement mechanisms that did not require force. The empire had not lost its borders. It had lost its wallet. From this point forward, policy operated inside financial constraints designed elsewhere. Every reform, every military decision, every administrative change had to fit within a structure whose primary purpose was not governance, but extraction. Debt did not destroy the empire by itself. What it destroyed was choice. From the outside, the Ottomans still appeared to govern. Laws were issued, armies were raised, diplomacy continued. But every serious decision now passed through a financial filter that the state did not control. What could be afforded mattered more than what was needed. War was no longer a strategic decision. It was a financial risk assessment. Reform was no longer a question of vision. It was a question of leftover revenue. Even survival depended on whether creditors approved the direction. This was the irony. The loans were taken to protect sovereignty, yet they became the mechanism that hollowed it out. The empire was not paralyzed by invasion. It was constrained by obligation. By the time military defeats followed, the outcome was already shaped. Armies can recover from losses. States can survive bad wars. But systems that lose financial autonomy lose the ability to adapt. The signature that once seemed harmless had altered the structure of power itself. Not instantly, not dramatically, but permanently. What followed were not mistakes made freely. They were decisions made inside a narrowing corridor, where every option carried costs determined elsewhere. The empire did not collapse because it failed to fight. It collapsed because, long before the final battles, it had lost the freedom to decide how to fight, when to fight, and whether it could afford not to. Empires rarely fall in a single moment. They weaken long before the collapse becomes visible. The Ottoman Empire did not lose control when armies crossed its borders. It lost control when financial decisions stopped being reversible. From that point on, power remained on the surface while autonomy drained underneath. Debt did not arrive as conquest. It arrived as assistance. It did not announce itself as domination. It presented itself as management. And because the empire still looked strong, the danger was easy to underestimate. What ultimately failed was not courage or intelligence. It was leverage. Once revenue was pledged elsewhere, time stopped working in the empire's favor. Every delay compounded costs. Every crisis narrowed options further. The state continued to function, but only within limits set by others. Authority remained, but choice did not. By the time land was lost, control had already been gone for decades. The first agreement did not end the empire, it redefined it. The Ottoman Empire did not lose a war that day. It lost control.